Well, hi everyone. Welcome back to another edition of Trinity Church's Midweek mini messages. These are kind of short devotionals, and at the moment we're looking through the book of Ezra, and we've made it as far as chapter 3. Last week we went through the whole of chapter 2, which was hard work because the names were so difficult to pronounce. But if you persevered and you continued to number 3, well, that's great news. Let's read chapter 3, verses 1 to 6 together. When the 7th month came and the children of Israel were in the towns, the people gathered as one man to Jerusalem. Then arose Jeshua the son of Jozadak with his fellow priests, and Zerubbabel the son of Shealtiel with his kinsmen. And they built the altar of the God of Israel to offer burnt offerings on it, as it is written in the law of Moses, the man of God. They set the altar in its place, for fear was on them because of the peoples of the land, and they offered burnt offerings on it to the Lord, burnt offerings morning and evening. And they kept the feast of booths as it is written, and offered the daily burnt offerings by number according to the rule, as each day required. And after that, the regular burnt offerings, the offerings at the new moon, and at all the appointed feasts of the Lord, and the offerings of everyone who made a freewill offering to the Lord. From the first day of the 7th month, they began to offer burnt offerings to the Lord. But the foundation of the temple of the Lord was not yet laid. Okay, so what's going on? In the last chapter, we got this whole long list of people, and we talked about how it was important to recognize, history and recognize the people that come before us. And you can see that on the previous episode. But this week, there's a few things in this passage as they get ready to lay the foundations that I think are really helpful to notice. First of all, notice in verse 1, it says, "When the 7th month came and the children of Israel were in the towns, the people gathered as one man to Jerusalem." I think the people were united under one vision. They were united under one purpose. They had the same vision in mind. They came together as one man. And I think that's a really cool thing to see, that when people, what can be done when we are united under the same vision. And I hope that will be true of us at Trinity. I think one of the other things is to recognize that actually, they hadn't been practicing some of these feasts and sacrifices for a while, and they recognized straight away the need that, well, hang on, before we go about building the temple, we need to get stuff right. We need to start sacrificing again. So they build an altar, which is cool. They recognized that they had strayed and that they needed to get back. That's a really good thing. And then also in verse 3, look at this. They set the altar in its place, for fear was on them because of the peoples of the land. So they were afraid of the people around them, and yet they offered burnt offerings on it to the Lord, burnt offerings morning and evening. I think it's really interesting, the word "for" there. They set the altar in its place. Well, why? For fear was on them because of the peoples of the land. So one of the reasons that they chose to worship was because of their fear of the people around them. So there's two main things that I want us to take away from that short passage as they look to kind of reestablish sacrifices and reestablish their worship practices together. Well, and the first thing is this. Firstly, the fear of the people around us is not a new phenomenon. That's something that's been around for centuries. It's so easy to get disheartened or discouraged or afraid because of the people around us, afraid of persecution, afraid of ridicule. And what I love about this is that the Israelites' reaction wasn't to then minimize what they did or be more covert in what they did. Their reaction was to worship. They were afraid, so they worshipped. And sometimes we can be afraid of sharing our faith. We could be afraid of talking about Jesus. But I think our reaction should be to worship all the more, because the more that we worship, we talked about this on Sunday, the more that we worship, the harder it is to do anything but celebrate and proclaim who God is. So that's the first thing, is that fear is not a new thing, and our reaction to fear of the people around us should be worship, because that will help us to tame that fear, to realize that God is bigger than our fear. And secondly, before any physical foundations were laid, before they went back and laid the physical foundations of the temple, they wanted to maintain those spiritual foundations. They wanted to lay those spiritual foundations. In Matthew 6:33, it says, seek first the kingdom of God and all his righteousness. And that's what they were doing. The first thing they were doing was seeking first the kingdom of God, seeking God first, re-establishing their worship and their practices. And we talked about this on Sunday. We talked about this idea of response and responsibility and how in Revelation 2 verses 1-7, if you weren't with us on Sunday, we talked about how in that letter, Jesus' letter dictated to John for the Ephesians, he says, you're doing so much right. You are enduring patiently. You're working hard. You're pointing out false teachers. You're doing so much right. But I have this against you, he said in verse 4. I have this against you that you've abandoned the love you had at first. And I think what the Israelites get right in this passage is that they recognize that first and foremost their call is to worship God. The first and foremost is to get those spiritual foundations right and then worry about the physical stuff. And I think that's what we can take away from that, is that our first call is to make sure that we have Jesus at the forefront of everything, that the gospel is central to everything. From there, we can do lots of great things. We have an exciting vision as a church, a vision to be multi-generational, multicultural, transformational, gospel-focused, to be a church that one day plants churches. We want to be that church, and that's exciting. That fills me with excitement just thinking about it. But if those are the primary things, if we build our foundation on those things and not, first and foremost, build our spiritual foundations on that love of Jesus, if we don't have Jesus at the forefront of all that we do, well then we're toiling for no reason, and I pray that it wouldn't be said of us by Jesus, I have this against you, you abandoned the love you had at first. I want us as a church, I want it for myself, that to be so consumed by who Jesus is that our first reaction is response and not a bunch of responsibilities. So I think that's what God is saying to us in this passage today as a church. Firstly, not to be afraid, or if we are afraid, to move that fear into worship of God, because God is greater than our fears. And secondly, we want to build spiritual foundations before we're building physical foundations. It's good to do lots of stuff for the kingdom of God. We're called to action. But if we're moved to action, but we're missing that spiritual foundation, there's a problem. So I'm going to pray into that. I hope you have a great week. And we'll see you on Sunday. Lord, thank you so much for the joy of the gospel. Thank you that we can lean into that truth of your son, Jesus. Lord, I pray that would be the first and foremost thing, that it would be our first love, and that out of that response, we're moved to action, not out of a sense of duty or obligation or responsibility. Lord, I pray that we would be like the Israelites, that we would set up in this story with Ezra, we would set up our foundations spiritually before we set them up physically. Lord, I pray that you would use us to bring you glory first and foremost, not in our actions, but in our hearts. Lord, I pray that our hearts will glorify you. And then as a result, we would be moved to action. When we're afraid, Lord, I pray that we would look to you, the author and perfecter of our faith. We'd keep our eyes fixed on you. Lord, would you use us? Would your kingdom come? Would your will be done on earth as it is in heaven? In your great name we pray. Amen.